Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today it's finally time to finish the Death Guard miniature. There's a lot of parts to cover here, mostly all the detail and organic parts that you regularly see on Death Guard miniatures, so if you've ever been stuck for ideas on how to go about painting these parts, or just want some general tips, this might be the video for you. So firstly here I'm going to tackle the loincloth, and I decided to do this a bit different from the box art, and instead I opted for a nice textured deep red cloth. So over a base coat of Citadel Corn Red, I get straight into the highlights with Mephiston Red. Sometimes you might be wondering why I highlight before shading down, as this seems a bit contrary to the standard base coat shade and highlight method. However, most of the time it's easier to glaze a colour darker than to go lighter, so often you might find you get smoother results by going brighter and wider than you think with the initial stages and then glaze back with the base coat and subsequent shading. This can be particularly useful for things like cloth and other highly blended areas. So for the shading here, I make a mix of Incubi Darkness and Corn Red. Using Incubi instead of black to shade results in a nice rich purple which works really well when shading reds. I carefully glaze this into the folds and recesses of the cloth. For the first real highlight stage here, I'm adding Squig Orange into Mephiston Red. I started by blocking in where the regular highlights would be placed, before adding some fine scratches to the raised folds. So here I keep adding Squig Orange into the highlights until I end up with only Squig Orange. You can always glaze back over these highlights with some very thin down Mephiston Red if the scratches start to look a bit too harsh. For the next highlight stage here, I start to add in some Towelite Ochre into the Squig Orange. This is followed by adding Ushabti Bone into the mix until I end up with pure Ushabti Bone. Finally, I applied some thinned Flesh Terrors contrast paint. This stage just helps to bring all the reds together, but I avoid applying too much to the highlighted areas as I like to keep these nice and bright. Next, it's time to paint the fleshy pipes and tentacles that you would tend to find on a lot of Death Guard models. For this, I'm going to use the same recipe I remember using in the studio. A general tip for painting great looking pale and dead looking flesh is to desaturate the colours you would normally use for skin tones. This time I do this by adding Administratum Grey into Cadian Flesh Tone. Using a very pale blue tone like Blue Horror also works really nicely, and it's worth having an experiment with this. An interesting thing, you will find that by adding complementary colours together, they will cancel each other out and the result is a more desaturated tone. Achieving a smooth base coat takes a few thin layers, and after that's done I make a mix of Screamer Pink with a touch of Doomball Brown. I apply this as a very thin shade over all of the fleshy areas and concentrating it into the recesses. It takes a few coats to get the shading deep enough. Once the shading is done, it's time to go back and tidy the base coat again. My plan for the tentacles here is to build them up to a darker purple towards the tip, so you can always mix a bit of the shade in with the base coat to start to create a bit of a transition here. Once that's done, I add a deep shade with a mix of Screamer Pink and Black. I apply this around where the pipes meet the armour and the deepest recesses. I also use this to start to darken down the tips of the tentacles. Now I apply some highlights by adding white into the flesh mix. There's a few skulls on this miniature, so I will tackle those next. For this, I'm going to use a very simple but effective recipe I often use for painting skulls. For the base coat, I used Ishabti bone and added Steel Legion drab into this for the soft shade. I glazed this on very thinly and it takes a few coats to build it up. I then pick out the teeth and deeper recesses using pure Steel Legion drab. For the deep shade, I use a mix of Steel Legion drab and Rhinox hide. I then apply this into the eye sockets and further pick out the deeper recesses. Now to brighten up the bone, I apply a layer of a 1:1 mix of Ushabti bone and AK 3rd Gen white. You could also use Screaming Skull instead. At the same time here, I'm carefully picking out the teeth, leaving the Steel Legion stage in the recesses. I keep adding white into the Ushabti until I end up with an edge highlight of pure white. Now there's some suitably gross looking pipes on this guy's backpack, and I decide to base coat these with Balor Brown. I add Ushabti into this to highlight towards the top of the pipes and around the drips, and carefully glaze back with thinned Balor Brown to smooth out the transitions. Once that's done, I'm going to go in and apply a more controlled highlight using pure Ushabti bone. Next, I added some shading using Scrag Brown. I carefully glazed this where the pipes join the backpack and around the recesses of the drops. Finally, I added some further highlights using a mix of Ushabti bone and white. I decided to add a deeper shade of Doomball Brown just to push the shading a bit more in places, and finally the pipes are complete. Now, like a lot of Death Guard miniatures, this one comes with a couple of cheerful little Nurglings. For these I wanted a nice warm contrasting tone to the rest of the Death Guard and the fleshy pipes we'd previously done. To do this, I start off with a base coat of Kislev Flesh. I make a shade using a 1-to-1 mix of Doomball Brown and Kislev Flesh, and add a bit of glaze medium and carefully wash this into the recesses of the skin. Once that's done, I go back with the base coat and carefully glaze this towards the top areas of the skin. Now I start to apply the first highlights by mixing grey cere into the Kislev. As before, the slight grey tone helps to desaturate the skin and makes it look a bit more unhealthy. Finally, I added some white into the mix to push the highlights brighter, using more controlled lines this time to further define the shapes of the skin. Now I add a shade of Screamer Pink and Black to the eyes and horns. After that's dry, I pick out the eyes using Evil Sun's red. This is followed by Troll Slayer orange, and finally a dot of Fire Dragon and white. I go back in with the shade now just to help the eyes stand out a little bit more. Then I paint in the bottom of the eyelids using some Sons of Horus green and carefully pick them out, adding a little bit of grey sear to highlight. So here I went in around the lips with a glaze of Screamer Pink and carefully pick out the lips by adding some Blue Horror. Finally, I picked out the horns by adding Administratum Grey into the Screamer Pink and Black mix. So lastly, I decided to add a little bit of yellow tone to the pustules, so I add some thin glazes of Plague Bearer contrast. And I used the same contrast paint just to add some lovely streaks coming down from the pustules. So this is the little Nurgling that sits on his shoulder, and I used the same previous skin recipes for this. He has a little tentacle arm, so I decided to glaze some Screamer Pink over this area, followed by adding a little bit of black to the Screamer Pink, which actually turns it a nice shade of purple. You can always mix a mid-tone between the base coat and Screamer Pink here to smooth out the transitions between. Once that's done, I added some highlights by adding the flesh tone mix into the Screamer and Black mix. And then added further highlights with grey sear and white. So now I went on to paint the horn, and this is a fairly standard recipe I tend to use for them. This one was a bit more tricky due to it having a Nurgling clinging onto it. However, I decided I wanted a nice transition from light at the bottom to dark at the top of the horn. So first I tried to get the transition smooth between Ushabti Bone and XV88 at the top. Once that's smooth enough, I go in with glazes of Doomball Brown towards the top of the horn. Then again, once that's smooth enough, I darken it down a bit further by adding black into the Doomball. So to highlight the horn, I added some white to Ushabti bone, and then added some final glazes of XV88 to smooth out the transitions. Finally, I added a few little nicks and scratches using Ushabti and white, and then picked them out with a dark brown. The last part to paint here is the head, however it's the most important focal point of any miniature, so I like to spend a bit of time here. I wanted to really bring the zombie look to life, and I really like the overall tone of the box art version. So I wanted to start with a nice bright tone that would pick up all the colour I wanted to glaze into the face. For an overall bright skin tone like this, I find it much easier to work from a lighter base coat. So with that being said, firstly I base coated the whole head using Ushabti bone, and applied careful glazes of Kislev flesh over this, leaving the Ushabti towards the top of the head and the raised surfaces. So now that we have a good base to work from, it's time to make this skin look a lot more unhealthy. I wasn't quite sure on how to achieve the tone that I wanted at first, but I soon found that adding Kantor into the Kislev got close to the tone I was looking for. However, it was a little bit too saturated, so I ended up adding a little bit of Eshin Grey in. One of the things that makes Nurgle and zombies and just undead things quite fun to paint is that once you have a nice base coat to work from, there really is no limit to the amount of different tones that you can add into the skin. Purples, pinks, greys and blues all work really well placed next to the green armor in this case. However, I can imagine other colours would also work quite well in combination with different schemes. So I'm just being quite patient here and building up the glazes slowly. And if I need to smooth out any of the transitions, I can just add a little bit more Kislev in between. I decided that I want a bit more of a purple in places here, so I add a little bit of Doomball into the glazes. I'm trying to get a bit of variation into the skin tones here. This head had some exposed skulls, so over the Ushabti bone I established some shading using a mix of Rhinox and Steel Legion. Then something that I like to do once I've got the messy parts out of the way here is to go in and pick everything out around the face in black. This just helps to keep everything neat and tidy and helps me to focus on the face. So after that's done, I add a touch of Khorne Red to some Kislev and place this around the edges of the flesh and boils on the head. You could also add a bit of Screamer Pink or just anything to make these bits look a bit gory and inflamed. And here you can see I've glazed a little bit of that screamer pink and black around the boils as well. So now I decide to just quickly go around and smooth out some of those transitions with a mix of Kislev and Ushabti bone. Then I go on to start to highlight the face with a mix of Ushabti bone and white. I pick the top corner of the head here where I want a nice soft highlight as it's reflecting most of the light. It's always worthwhile bearing in mind the golden angle as you are painting your miniature. This is the front focal point of the model, so I want a nice smooth and bright highlight here to draw the viewer's focus. Now I'm just adding a slight highlight with Kislev flesh around the redder areas. Now I'm just going back to the skull and relayering the Ushabti bone base coat. This is followed by a glaze of XV88, just to add a little bit of colour back in. Then I continue to add highlights and pick out the teeth by adding white into the Ushabti bone as with the other skulls. So continuing on with the skin again, I start to pick out the boils with Kislev Flesh, and in places I add some blue horror into the highlights just to separate it a little bit from the other parts of the flesh. So I carefully pick out the white of the eye using grey sear. Any cold off-white would work quite nicely for this. Then I start to paint in the pupil with a mix of Eshin Grey and Cantor. Mostly this is just because it was on my palette at the time, but you could also use any other grey-blue like Dark Reaper. And feel free to add some reflection dots with pure white if you have the brush control. So for the horn here, I base coated with a mix of Elysian Green, Storm Vermin Fur and a slight bit of Rhinox. I thought a slight bit of green tinge would work, however really I could have just used Storm Vermin. I'm not really sure that it made much difference in the end. So for the highlights on this, it was really very straightforward. First I used Baneblade Brown and then simply added white to this for the subsequent finer highlights, and some final dot highlights of white to finish it. If you need to, you can also add some shading with glazes of Rhinox hide. So here we have the finished head, and this concludes part 2 of how to paint Death Guard. Hopefully some of the recipes and techniques in this video were useful to you, even if you don't collect Death Guard. As usual, a massive thank you to everyone here on Patreon for your continued support. I have now added a second tier which going forward will feature 2 exclusive videos like this per month, covering a range of different topics. Catch you next time, guys.